So what that really showed is that clear back in 1780, we really had colonists fighting against colonists, which really would have been the first example of civil war. 80 years after this, by the way, the country will be in a civil war. So, kind of went from there. All right, we're moving on to colonial prisoners of war. Kind of an interesting story. Colonial prisoners of war. Now, as the Revolutionary War is raging in the South, there are thousands of colonial prisoners that are being held on retired British warships. So while the fighting's going on strong in the South, in the North, there are some retired British warships that are anchored in the East River. And these retired British warships in the East River are holding Patriot colonial prisoners of war. And they've been captured at every different theater of the war. All these different battles we've had, wins and losses, there have been colonial Patriot soldiers that have been captured. And where they take them is on these retired warships that they have docked in the East River. On these warships, their masts and the canvas and all the rigging and all that have been stripped off the ships. Their gun ports have been sealed shut. So if you look at these colonial ships, the side of them, in the old days, they had open areas where cannons were pushed out. And what they've done is they've taken all the masts and everything and they've boxed these over, they've closed them, and basically you have the hull of the ship, so to speak, the basement of the ship. There's nobody on deck, there's no mast, there's no rigging, and all the portholes are closed shut, and basically you just have the bottom of the ship. Now, in their glory days, these British ships were made to carry a crew of 350 men. So 350 men could be fairly comfortable in the bottom of this ship when they traveled. Well, as far as prisoners of war, there was as many as 1,400 stacked into these retired warships. So you can imagine what that would be like. So you've got an area that might be comfortable for 350 men. All of a sudden now they've got 1,400 prisoners in the hull of that ship. Now, the only person other than British guards that are on those ships is a humanitarian by the name of Elizabeth Bergen. Elizabeth Bergen is a humanitarian. What is, Carly, my dear, a humanitarian? It costs actually $0.00 to be a decent human being. Did you know that? So what's a humanitarian? Someone that would be a decent human being that would be helping others. Okay, and that's what Elizabeth Bergen was. She was a humanitarian, somebody that went around and tried to help others. Now, the only people that know what's going on these prisoner of war ships are the British guards and obviously the captives, but also humanitarian Elizabeth Bergen is a witness to what takes place on these ships, because the British allowed her to bring food, supplies, and comfort to the men that were captured. And the only reason she got to do that is because she was a woman, and for security reasons, she didn't think she would be any risk to break out any prisoners. So they allowed her to come in. They had to treat him somewhat humanely. They had to feed him, give him a few supplies. And so she was allowed to come in by the British government and provide that relief to these soldiers on these different ships. So Elizabeth Bergen was a witness to what took place on those ships. She was allowed to bring food, supplies, and comfort to the men. And only because she was a woman, because of security concerns, there's no way they would let men come in and perform this duty, because they would feel like there'd be a risk of escape. Now here's some of the conditions that Miss Bergen witnessed that were just horrific. I'll give you 4 examples of what was going on these ships in which these men were held prisoner. Number 1, first of all, they were fed uncooked meat with wormy bread. They were fed quite consistently uncooked meat, raw meat, and the bread they were given to eat with it was usually worm infested. So uncooked meat with wormy bread would be an example of what she witnessed. What do you think else was rampant among those prisoners? Disease. Diseases were just horrible, just horribly rampant. A lot of sick prisoners. So disease was rampant among the prisoners. Now think about this. The air was so thick below deck that they couldn't even light a candle because there wasn't enough oxygen to get the candle lit. Couldn't even light a candle. That's how lack of oxygen there was in those areas below deck. So the air was so thick below deck that candles could not be lit because of the lack of oxygen. And there was virtually no ventilation whatsoever. Can you imagine that? You know when you get hot and you want a window open? Can you imagine just being in that situation, 1,400 men crammed in below deck in an area that was suitable for 350 and no ventilation? Because what did they do with the ventilation holes? Boarded them up.
So where did they go to the bathroom?
Yeah. Now, because of these conditions, they averaged 10 to 12 deaths a day. 10 to 12 deaths a day because of these conditions. If you were on a colonial prisoner of war ship, 1,400 men, they were averaging 10 to 12 dead a day. Matter of fact, if you can imagine this, each morning they would open up the deck and the British guards would yell, "Rebels, turn out your dead." That's the first thing that happened in the morning. They would swing open the door of the deck and the British guards would bark out the command, "Rebels, turn out your dead." And the dead were taken off the ships, and where do you think they buried them? Right on the shoreline. Right on the shoreline of the East River. Now, who buried them? Prisoners. So, even though it was a grotesque duty, they were very eager if they had the opportunity to volunteer for that, because what happened? They get out of the ship and get some fresh air. Even though there would be a horrible job, and I'm sure those dead bodies were just gross, they would eagerly volunteer to be part of the burial routine daily. Now, did these guys have any chance to get out of this situation? Did the British give them a chance? Every single prisoner was given the opportunity to get out of there. All they had to do was join the British Navy and swear their allegiance to the king. Anybody had that offer. Of all of the prisoners of war, which we'll talk about, that were held during this time, the Revolutionary War years, every single one had the opportunity to get out of that situation by simply joining the British Navy and swearing their allegiance to the king. If they did that, they would be immediately set free and serve in the British Navy. Not one prisoner of war recorded took that deal. Not one. So instead, these men chose agonizing death rather than becoming a traitor. And there's no recorded incidences of any prisoners of war taking the deal. Not one. Does that mean maybe there was? I mean, there's just no recorded. Now, there's no way they escaped. The possibility of escape was impossible. Incredibly risky. Okay? What would they do if you tried to escape? They shoot you, which might have been better, actually. Who knows? The only way they were going to have a chance to escape is if they got any help from the outside. And they're going to get some help from the outside. Who's going to provide it?
Elizabeth.
Elizabeth Bergen. Now this is a great story. What Bergen did after seeing the horrible conditions is she decided she was going to try to make an effort to save as many as she could. She knew she wasn't going to save a lot. I mean, there's 1,400 on each ship, and there's probably several ships docked. But she devised a plan that she brought drugs into the ship, and they were slipped into the guards' beer at night. Guards were very common to drink beer at night. And it would leave them incapacitated. So she snuck drugs in to these ships, and then those drugs were put in the guards' beer in the evening, which left them incapacitated. Well, when the guard passed out, the key to the top side opening was taken from the guard. They opened the top side opening, and many men escaped into waiting boats that Mrs. Bergen and her Patriot followers provided. So they snuck boats up to those ships, and then they would drug the guards. The drugs would make the guards incapacitated. They'd steal the guard's key, open the hatch, let them out, and actually they would put everything back to normal, so to speak, and they're done. Well, they estimated through documentation that Elizabeth Bergen probably rescued approximately 200 prisoners in the next few weeks using those same tactics before she was discovered herself by British officials. So for several weeks she used this tactic of drugging the guards and getting prisoners out, and they estimate she probably got about 200 out before she was discovered. I didn't say caught, I said discovered. When British officials discovered that Elizabeth Bergen was doing this, they put a price on her head. What does that mean? You kill her and bring her in, we'll give you a reward. And that, at that time, the price was 200 British pounds. 200 British pounds. If you want to know how much that money that was, it would take a British soldier 20 years of service to earn 200 pounds. So they put quite a bounty on her head. 200 British pounds, and it would take a soldier in the British Army or Navy about 20 years to earn that kind of money serving their country. Well, they never did catch Elizabeth Bergen. She escaped from New York, and she was so well received by George Washington for her contribution to the Revolution that he gave her a military pension for the rest of her life. So George Washington was so taken back by her heroic efforts in trying to save those prisoners of war that after her escape from New York, when everything was said and done, she received a military pension for the rest of her life. Now, great story. She saved 200, which was wonderful. Now, during the course of the American Revolution, listen to the statistic, they estimate that about 8,000 Patriot soldiers, or patriots, not just soldiers, but militia, about 8,000 colonial patriots lost their lives in the Revolutionary War. About 8,000 deaths in battles in the war. Okay? It was also estimated that during the course of the American Revolution, somewhere between 10 and 12,000 patriots lost their lives in these prison boats. So more patriots lost their lives as prisoner of war than lost them in battle. About 8,000 in battle. They estimated between 10 and 12,000 colonists died in those prison ships over the 6 years of the Revolutionary War. That's how bad they were. So she made a very small dent in the number of deaths, but her heroism was quite impressive, that she would put herself at risk. Because if they caught her, what were they going to do? Kill her, no question. Okay? Okay, let's move to our next subtopic then, which is continued failure in the South. We're not doing very good. The American colonial army and the militia are not doing very good in the South. Continual failure in the South. Well, as the Revolutionary War continues in the South, American soldiers are falling in alarming numbers. We're losing a lot of American soldiers in this battle in the South. And one example of that happened on August 16th, 1780, in the Battle of Camden. August 16th, 1780, the Battle of Camden, which is on your sheet. And that took place in South Carolina. On August 16th, 1780, the Battle of Camden in South Carolina. Now we have a huge advantage at the start of this battle because there's 4,000 American soldiers fighting against about 2,500 British soldiers. So when we start the Battle of Camden, we're looking at about 4,000 soldiers that we have command of in battle, and the British only have 2,500. And for two reasons, the British still kick our fanny there. One being that they had better leadership. Okay? George Washington wasn't fighting himself at the Battle of Camden. So you had other colonial officers that were leading these troops. But the problem was the British were led by General Charles Cornwallis, who we've already talked about, a master general, and they just had much better leadership. That was one reason that the British were defeating the Americans, despite the fact they had a lot less soldiers, is because they had better leadership under British General Cornwallis. The second reason was kind of self-inflicted. Our patriot soldiers did something the day before the battle that wasn't very bright, but I don't know how you blame them. They're very hungry, they're starving, and they find a stash of unripe peaches. And despite the fact that they know that they're not ripe, they eat them anyway because they're very hungry. What happens if you eat too many unripe peaches? You get sick, deathly ill. And it just so happened that by the time they ate these peaches, went into battle, that period of time is when it took effect. And when they went into battle, they were deathly ill, just sicker than a dog, which isn't really going to help you much. So a day earlier, on August 15th, these starving colonial soldiers found a stash of unripe peaches. They ate them, and it caused many, many of the men to become deathly ill during the battle. And they say that this sickness probably contributed to their loss, because in that battle, 2,000 patriots were either killed, wounded, or captured. So they lost half their force in the Battle of Camden because, one, they were outsmarted by better leader in Cornwallis, but two, they were all deathly ill because they ate a bunch of unripe peaches the day before, which did not let them fight to their ability. Well, it's not looking good in the South. It looks like the South is going to fall to the British, and if the South falls, the North would probably soon follow. So we were looking pretty bad right now at this time. And basically, we're retreating. Colonial soldiers are retreating like crazy because the British are advancing upon us. So as we retreat, what are we trying to pick up that belongs to us on the retreat? What are we trying to pick up as we retreat? Arms, cannons, equipment. So as the colonial soldiers run from the British advance, they are desperately attempting to pick up as much equipment as possible in the retreat so it doesn't fall where? In the hands of the British. Now this brings us to another unknown in American history. One of these soldiers that was trying very hard to pick up equipment was what they called a supersized patriot by the name of Peter Francisco. Peter Francisco. This was a patriot soldier, Peter Francisco. They referred to him as what? The Virginia Giant. He was known in the Continental Army as the Virginia Giant. The guy was 6'6", and weighed 280 pounds. He was a huge man. Huge man. Because what were men like in those days? They were much smaller. When I take you to old Alexandria in about a year or so, and we go into some of the old Irish pub down there and kind of show you that colonial, the doors are like this tall. Because that's how tall everybody was in those days. This guy was unusual. He was 6'6", 280 pounds. Now, during documentation of this time, it was written that this Francisco picked up a cannon that weighed like 1,100 pounds during the retreat and hoisted it up on his shoulders and hid it from the British. So they couldn't get it. It was a great cannon, great piece of equipment you didn't want to leave behind. According to legend or rumor, but it's written like it would be true, he hoisted up an 1,100-pound cannon and hid it from the British. Matter of fact, George Washington was so impressed with Peter Francisco, he referred to him as a one-man army. Now, he wasn't from America. He had to come from somewhere. Everybody came from somewhere. He happened to come from Portugal. But nobody really knew how he ever got up in America, how he ever got here. He never really told anybody. But the research shows that he was from Portugal, but nobody knew how he ever got to America in the first place. And he was a fearless and ferocious fellow, but despite his efforts, the British continued to press on in the South, and we're still in a world of hurt. But we have to have a change to get better. The change is the next subtopic, which is what, Buck? change in American military strategy. We're going to have a change in the strategy that we're using, or we are not going to win this war. Well, after their victory at Camden, the Redcoats marched towards Charlotte, North Carolina. And we were in a position, the Americans, that they could no longer engage the British and hope to win. There's no way we could be on the offensive and win a battle. That's where we were at this point. And Washington sees that the commanders that he has in the South leading the Southern forces are not working out. They're getting crushed. So what does Washington do? When your team loses too many games as a coach, what do? Fire the coach and hire a new one to bring the program back. Well, this is what Washington did. He fired the old generals and he assigned a new general to lead the Southern campaign, General Nathaniel Greene. General Nathaniel Greene is selected by George Washington to be the overall commander of colonial forces in the South. Okay? In the South. And so this is going to be a big change for the Americans, and what Greene's going to do is he's going to bring in a new strategy. Now this strategy, I'm going to tell you kind of a funny story, and you're going to enjoy it. General Greene changed the military strategy to what he called a hit and run campaign. Hit and run campaign. So General Greene is going to change the military strategy at this point to a hit and run campaign. Now what's that mean? Are you trying to win a battle? No, you're just trying to hit them enough times to wear them out. Story. 1970.